I think all I want to say is amen, let's go. And you know, I've often heard speakers say after they've had a nice introduction, I wish my mother could have heard that. Law, I wish Peggy could have heard that. Dean, you have such an extraordinary way with words, and I've always loved it when you've been asked to do obituaries for extraordinary gifts. I think I just heard my obituary, and I thank you for it. And Mr. President, it's an honor to be on this campus and to share some time with you, getting to know you better, and Debbie, as well as to be with a number of you who are friends of long standing and others who I hope will be friends before either this night or this term of office is over. And I thank you for your time and care and affirmation of the moderator. I'm not naive enough to think that the standing is for Heath. I know it's a part of our tradition for the moderator, and it is an honor to be the recipient of that kind of love for the denomination. So I thank you for enabling me to receive that tonight. And I accept it on behalf of our denomination, a denomination that is worthy of being loved, that has a great deal to offer. And frankly, folks, one that I'm so excited about, much more excited about, and I was excited 2 years ago. But today, I'm even more so, and I'm going to share with you a little bit of the whys and wherefores. Of course, I'm tempted to just spend my time telling you Dean Thompson stories. I think you'd probably enjoy that a whole lot more than you would my talking about the state of the church. But that wasn't what I was invited to do, so I will try to be much more dignified than that, because if I told Dean Thompson stories, I wouldn't be very dignified. But Dean and Rebecca have been and still are such great friends, and there are so many things I'd love to tell you about it. But at any rate, again, I'm thankful to you for both inviting Dean to introduce me and also Dean for those beautiful words. I'm aware also tonight that you have already been discussing the fact that one of the saints of this community has made her journey to heaven, that being Leela Rhodes. And I wanted to mention that because I did not know her, but I've certainly known her reputation and know that her spirit on this campus was extraordinary and meant so much to so many people. And her daughter Catherine is one of my dear friends, and so I have been in communication with her over the last 24 hours as she is dealing with the reality that her relationship with her mother has taken on a new form. But I do want to say to you as a community that I'm thinking of you, and the fact that for many of you this is a personal loss also. I also want to say, as I talk about some of the people who have been a part of this campus, that one of my dear friends and one of the formative relationships I had many years ago when I became president of the Presbyterian School of Christian Education was with Alum. Al and Grace were our neighbors in Richmond, and we got to know them and remained close friends with Al until his death. In fact, Al was at a church in Winston-Salem where my daughter and son-in-law and grandson were actively involved, and they became like family. And so we would continue to see him up until we couldn't do that any longer. But I want to tell you about a situation, a time when Al came to see me. It was the day of my inauguration. And it was, for any of you who've gone through an inauguration, it's an exhausting day. It's absolutely exhilarating, but it's exhausting. And Al and Grace just stopped by the house. He said, I just want to check on how you're doing, Heath. I said, I'm doing okay. I'm tired. I had my shoes off, but they came in and sat down. And he said, I want to give you a piece of advice. Well, for those of us who knew Al Wynn, advice giving was not something that was his tradition. He would often respond when people asked for any information, but to initiate the fact that he wanted to give advice was a little bit out of character. So as tired as I was, I sat to the edge of the sofa because I wanted to hear what this man was going to tell me. And he said, when I was president of Louisville Seminary, we were going through a very difficult time financially. And he said, I was quite concerned at one of those times that I was going to have to be the person who closed the doors and have to make that hard decision. And he said, I just couldn't sleep. I was so concerned about how to handle this. And finally, one night, he says, it was as if God spoke out loud to me. and said, Al Wynn, listen to me. I have known and loved Louisville Seminary long before you ever got there. And if I want Louisville Seminary to continue to serve me, it will stay here long after you're gone. Now lie down and go back to sleep. Brilliant words for a new young president, but also brilliant words for all of us who are going through times of transition in a world where we're having to give up things that we've loved and are concerned about what that means, including the fact that there are questions being asked as to whether or not the U.S.A. is dying. And I'll talk about that in some of what I'm hearing and seeing as we move along. During these 18 or 20 months, 22 months now, it's only 2 months left. You want to know how many days? I've loved it. It's been a joy. But during this time, as I have had a chance to speak to people, I've used different Bible passages for various sermons or speeches or talks. But there are three that I've kept coming back to, three of the simplest, least complicated, most memorized Bible passages that most of us know. So without being a sophisticated theologian, I want to mention them and use them and weave them into what I'm going to share with you about what I'm seeing happening in our denomination. The first one is 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the love chapter that we all know so well. And you can quote it as can I. It's inscribed in my wedding ring, and we probably have had it read at most of many of the services of celebration or of love. But it also, it's the 8th verse that I want to talk about specifically. And that's the one that says, for now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we'll see face to face. Now we only know in part, then it'll be revealed to us. One of the things that I've been so conscious of in our denomination is the fact that for too long we've thought that what we were seeing in the mirror was the truth. Our vision of the truth is what we believed. And I'm talking all sides of the theological spectrum. I'm not picking on anybody when I say this, folks. All of us have said, you may know what you think is the truth, but I know the real truth. And folks, what this passage says is it hasn't been revealed to us. None of us knows the full truth yet. All of us are in the process of discovering it. And what I often say to folk who are in major divisions about whether or not theologically we should believe this way or that way, what I say is how wonderful it would be if you would say, here, look in my mirror, and let me show you what I'm seeing. And let me share with you what you are seeing, or let you share with me what you are seeing. And maybe between us we can get a fuller glimpse of what the real truth is, even knowing that isn't the full truth. But how much better it would be if we could share it rather than my telling you why my dim mirror is more truthful than your dim mirror is. And so I am hearing increasingly in our denomination people who are beginning to look into one another's mirrors. The anger that I saw when I was elected as moderator 2 years ago has subsided dramatically. If you could go with me, and I wish you all could be in my pocket and see the church as I'm having a chance to see it. You were so right in saying one of the gifts of the moderator is to see the church in ways that most people don't have that privilege. But if you could go with me to the presbyteries and to churches and hear the difference in the conversation that I'm hearing now compared to what I heard a year ago or a year and a half ago, it's like two different denominations. You go, I went then, and people would say before I got there, Heath, you need to be aware that we're going to be dealing with certain topics, and we've got these 7 people who are going to be furious, and we've got, all of those things. And yet now when I go, consistently I'm told after I leave, we're so glad you came to this Presbyterian meeting, because we loved each other. We talked about where we're going and how we're going to be the church. And I'm also seeing that in our remnant churches. We mentioned that at our dinner table a while ago. As I'm going into a number of churches that have split, and the remnant congregation, usually much smaller than the group that has left, is saying to me, we were really devastated and felt that we didn't have any future when out of our 1,000-member church, 800 people left. How are we going to afford the building? How are we going to deal with the programs that we've committed ourselves to? On and on and on. And they said, it's just been phenomenal. We as 200 members are now being the church rather than fighting about the church. And we're seeing an opportunity to grow and to come together in ways that we just didn't believe we would ever know. And we hadn't thought about the fact that might be what the outcome of these decisions would be. So, people ask, are we witnessing death in our Presbyterian Church, U.S.A.? And what I say is, the church I grew up in the 50s and 60s, yeah. That part of what the PC U.S.A. and its predecessor bodies is dying or has died. I don't go to suburban churches now like the one I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, where there were 100 of us as senior highs going to senior high fellowship every Sunday night. And this wasn't one of the big churches in Richmond, or where you had folding chairs coming down the center aisle in our brand new sanctuary because we'd already outgrown it, and we went to 2 worship services and so on. I don't think we're going to see that again, folks. I don't think that's a part of the calling of what we as a denomination will be seeing. I don't dare to predict what God will have for us to do or see, but in my own perception, what we are finding is that the core of who we are has become so much more significant than the societal expectation that we all join a church. And as you know, if you've studied anything about the statistics of our denomination, we've had a large number of people leave, but statistically, what we have learned through research in downtown here in Louisville is that we have lost over 50% of those people to secularization, to folks who are no longer being a part of any faith community. Because the box that we check for religious preference that says none is the fastest growing box that in our nation in regard to religion. And folks, when Heath Rada was a kid in high school, my mama would have died if she'd seen me check the box none. And I frankly would have died myself because all of us thought we were supposed to be a part of a church. Now it doesn't matter. So many people say, it just doesn't make any difference. Sure, I'll check none because it doesn't have relevance for me. Well, certainly it does, we know. But one of the false assumptions that has come about and has particularly been made significant by the secular media is that the Presbyterian Church is dying because people are unhappy with decisions we've made about gay marriage or divestment or other things. Yes, we've lost members. Yes, we've lost large churches. I don't minimize the impact of that, but it's wrong to say that that is the majority of why our church is decreasing. And it's also equally significant to realize that though we lost in 2013 and 14, I don't have the statistics for 15 yet, but 2013 and 14 we lost about 250,000 members. During those same 2 years, we gained 147,000 members. And that's significant because people joined the church because they wanted to be a part of it, not because society said we're all supposed to join a church. And so there's good news, folks, a lot of good news, and we're particularly seeing a lot of the growth come with young adults in urban areas. Young adults are going back to church in urban areas, and they're giving 3 primary reasons as to why. The first they call us a safe place. We're a place where they say the Presbyterian Church is a place I can go and I can ask any question I want to and don't feel like somebody's going to condemn me or say I'm going to hell because I asked that question or shush, you ought to be ashamed of yourself or anything. And the best example I know to share about that is my own granddaughter who Maundy Thursday a year ago was at church in Boulder, Colorado with her mom and dad who were both Presbyterian elders. Anna Grace was 7 at the time, and in their church, the tradition is that the active elders bring an empty cross down the center aisle and erect it at the front of the church, and it stays up there through Easter. So, as the cross was coming down the aisle and they were standing up singing, Anna Grace, in a stage whisper, says, "Mama, what's the big deal about the cross?" Well, Mary Talmadge almost hyperventilated, my daughter. She said, honey, you know the big deal about the cross. We've talked about it since you were born. You wear a cross. You know why this is important. But Mama, didn't Jesus die on the cross? Yeah. And didn't he come alive again, Mama? Yes. Mama, you don't believe that. People don't come alive again. You know they don't. And Mary Talmadge said, honey, we'll talk about this after church. And so, as any appropriate young adult mother in her early 40s would do, she came home and called Mother and Dad. And said, I thought I'd have a faith crisis when my child was a teenager, maybe. I didn't expect it at age 7. But then she said the most significant thing. She said, you know, I stopped and realized a lot of people heard Anna Grace ask that question. And I was so grateful I was in a Presbyterian church because there wasn't one person who heard her who wouldn't have turned around to her had there been an opportunity at that moment and said, you ask those questions, girl. That's exactly why we're here, to ask and to learn and to grow. And she said, the second thing I want to do is that I thank you, Mom and Dad, because you reared me in a church community that allowed me to ask the questions. And at age 44, I have so many contemporaries who are fed up and won't go to church because they say it's hypocritical, you're boxed in, you can't be who you are, feel that you should be. And she says, and I worked through all that years ago. I'm so grateful. I think that's a badge of honor for our denomination in the appropriate way that badges of honor might be given. The second thing they're saying, these young adults, is we feel that that the Presbyterian Church is a church without walls. It's a place where people come to be fueled. It's a place where they come to have community and get to know one another. But they also say, we may not come every Sunday. And if you know the trends going on in our denomination, young adults are not coming to church every Sunday. They're out with soccer, or they're out hiking, or they're doing other things. But if they are included and involved in feeding the homeless on Wednesday night, they're never going to miss. If they're asked to work with the youth on Saturday morning on a service project, they're going to always be there. And they are going to be in church. It's just not necessarily with the same degree of regularity that many of us grew up thinking is what God expected of us. And so the second one is we're a church without walls because we get outside the church and we serve. And the third thing they said about us as Presbyterians is, or are saying, is that we are a church that embraces diversity. Now, does that mean everybody believes that gay marriage is the right decision? Does that mean that everybody believes the same thing about where the Muslims and the Christians ought to relate together, on and on? No. But what it does say, what they are saying is, we come into church on Sunday morning and we gather around the communion table, and every single person is welcome, and we will love each other in spite of the fact that we will disagree. And again, those three things are significant. And we got this data from 3 churches. My church, Grace Covenant Presbyterian in Asheville, North Carolina, where we suddenly have boomed and have 900 members, and we weren't expecting that kind of growth. And last year, for the first time in our history, we have more members under the age of 45 than over. Secondly, White Memorial in Raleigh with 4,000 members, and Myers Park in Charlotte with 5,000 members. These 3 North Carolina churches. And they're the ones that we surveyed and where we found that kind of information. And as I say these things and share these statistics around the denomination, consistently I'm being told by people in urban areas and suburban growing areas that this is so much the pattern that they're seeing too. It's not happening in the rural church. It's not happening in a number of the churches in areas of town that have been more isolated because of economic issues or racial divides or whatever to the same extent. But I do think that we see some exciting trends coming with that, which we need to fall back on and rely on. So the first passage is that there are people who are seeing glimpses of the truth and finding ways to serve, as it talks about in 1 Corinthians 13, and to show love. The second is the familiar passage of John 21. This is the one about Jesus appearing for the third time on the coast, on the shore. Fishermen are out there, Peter and the gang. They've been exhausted, they've been overwhelmed, they thought, what in the world has happened to us and our Savior? He's come back to us twice, but we're still in this tornadic experience of wondering, what are we to do next, and how are we going to do this? And we know he told us that these kinds of things were going to happen, but it's actually happened, and that's like the case for many of us. When those things do, we suddenly are caught short. Well, they didn't recognize this guy on the coast. Part of that was from what the Bible says. This was dawn, and they were 100 or more yards off the coast. So it's very understandable that they might not have recognized the man. What is so fascinating is that when Jesus hollered out to them and said, "You caught the fish," and they said, "No," and he says, "Well, then cast your net on the other side of the boat." The fascinating thing is they did it. Because, folks, we're talking about men, I'm sorry that was the case in that time, but we're talking about men who were professional fishermen. They had known what they were doing. You always set up your rig and cast your nets on the same side of the boat. And yet the stranger says, "Do this and move your net to the other side of the boat." And they did it, and of course, caught so many fish, they couldn't even pull in the nets. They had to drag the boat and the nets to the shore. The reality there in terms of how it's relating to our denomination is, I'm saying to you, what I am seeing and hearing is a church that's crying out to say, how do we cast our nets on the other side of the boat? We haven't been catching fish like we're supposed to. Our job needs to be done better. Our responsibility to Jesus needs to be carried out more fully. How do we do this? And so it's interesting to watch as churches try to determine what is happening. Our 1,001 new worshiping communities that many of you know about have been one success story in our denomination. We have about 350 of them now, and they represent all facets of our population, much more diverse than us traditionally white, older Presbyterians represent in terms of the demographics. The glorious thing is the representation of our new worshiping communities is much more consistent with the demographics of how our nation is becoming, as opposed to the demographics of what our Presbyterian Church has always been. I went to one about a month ago in Kalispell, Montana. The name of the worshiping, First Presbyterian Church, Kalispell, has, I think they have 180 members, something in that neighborhood. Nice little church, strong, doing good things. And they've started a new ministry. And the new ministry is called Serious Juju. I have no idea, but at any rate, that's what it's called. And so when they that night invited us to go to worship at Serious Juju, the Presbyterian and the folks who were guests. So we went to a warehouse right on the edge of town, and as we went into the warehouse, there were dozens of teenagers who were tattooed everywhere that they weren't pierced, and whose hair was every color in the rainbow, on their skateboards, skateboarding all over this room, this huge warehouse. And they fed us supper. We sat down. They led us in worship, a communion service. There was an ordained clergy person who shared the elements, but they participated in the sharing. And 3 of them were chosen to tell their stories about why Serious Juju made a difference in their lives. All 3 of these young people said, we didn't grow up in a house that had a Bible. It wasn't until we started coming here we ever saw a Bible. We heard about Jesus, but that didn't mean anything. It certainly wasn't personal. But they went into great detail about how this was impacting their lives. One of the 3 was a 15-year-old boy whose parents the day before had chosen to separate and divorce. They had had a dysfunctional, upset, angry family for a long time. But he was heartbroken still that this was happening. And he said to us with emotion, "I couldn't wait to get here last night because this was my family and I knew they were going to be there and support me and care for me." The other thing these 3 young people were asked to do was share their favorite Bible passage. And so each one of them shared a Bible passage. Well, first of all, realized many of them hadn't read the Bible until not long ago. One of the young men said, well, I tell you, I have never read the Bible until the last month. And he said, but I have, and he says, our advisor here advised me to read the book of John. And so he said, I've been reading about John. He says, and I want to tell you what my new favorite passage is, because I want to make sure you've all heard it. He said, it's from John, it's in chapter 3, and it's verse 16. Well, you can imagine this group of Presbyterian ministers and ordained educators, but we were on the edge of our seats, because he said to us, in ways that we were hearing God's word like we've never heard it before, God gave Jesus for us. God did this in a way that's very personal for each one of us. And folks, there was hardly a dry eye in the room to have this 16-year-old boy telling us about John 3:16, as though we had never heard it. And what a gift it is. And there are example after example after example that I'd love to share with you about what's going on in some of our new worshiping communities, because some folks are daring to cast the net on the other side of the boat. For the past 2 weeks, I've been on a pilgrimage across Germany, Hungary, and Greece. I got home Friday night, and I listened and learned over there about the plight of the immigrant and refugee situation in each of those countries. I was asked to go over as a mediator to work with both Reformed church leaders and with government leaders to talk about the plight and the dissension that's going on, because the church is saying we need to do one thing and the government's saying we need to do something else, and they're at crossroads. And they asked if a representative from our denomination, because of the respect our denomination has, and Cliff Kirkpatrick, you were one of the huge reasons that we continue to have this international love and affirmation. But they want to hear from us. They want us to participate in their lives, because in many instances we brought the good news to them. But in even more instances, we have helped develop what ministry, what love, what the church should be, and been partners with them. So when they have a need, they say, please help us. It was a powerful time. And when somebody asked me yesterday, what was your biggest surprise as you were seeing this situation, Heath, my immediate response was the enormity of the situation. Over and over again, we were told that this was not a refugee crisis. It was a governmental crisis. What do countries do to respond appropriately? In Germany, there are now 1.2 million refugees who have been absorbed into and integrated into their country, not living in camps. These are people who've been given homes. They're being integrated into the educational system. Many of them have jobs. They're learning language. I went to several language schools where these folks from Afghanistan and Syria and other places were learning German, and all with eagerness and ready to get out and be contributing members of their society, even though they've gone through horrendous circumstances to get there. But the migration continues, like from Turkey to Greece, where we visited a camp in Samos, on the island of Samos Island, which houses between 300 and 400 residents. These people have traveled across treacherous waters. Some were victims of opportunists, people who sold them tickets at unbelievable prices to make the passage. I stepped out of the van we were in by a boat that was filled with life preservers. They were still wet, and I realized that a group had just come in. And as I looked at them, I realized that most of those life preservers were bogus. They weren't real life preservers. They would never have floated or have allowed people to be alive, and yet they had been sold to these people as opportunists, again, were looking for ways to take advantage of them. When I went to the camp that was there, I became aware of the fact that on March the 20th, just before we went there, the European Union had made the decision to change the law, and no longer were these refugees going to be welcomed and enabled to find a way to be integrated into the communities, but they were imprisoned. They couldn't get out. There were barbed wire. I mean, it was exactly like when I've done prison visitation. It was a prison. And the children would come up and smile at us through the wires. We were invited to go in, but our guide wisely said, I think we shouldn't, because all that does is rub it in the face one more time of these people that we can go in and out, and that they can't. And they haven't done anything wrong. They haven't done anything wrong except try to fight for their own survival. Their likelihood of survival is questionable because most of them are going to be sent back home. And if they go back home, the very reasons they left was so they could find a life. And what's going to happen to them? Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions have come, and more are trying to come. And by the way, in case you're interested, we in the United States have now accepted 2,000 of these immigrants to live in our midst. Why so few? I'm not trying to stand here and be extraordinarily critical of our government, because I know many people are trying to make wise decisions. But the reality is that people are afraid, and that we are being instilled with fear everywhere we turn. We fear that these people might try to harm us, or that they will outnumber us, or that they'll take over our comfortable positions. We fear that who they are is so different from who we are that we'll lose our identity as Americans or as Christians or whatever it is that we claim and are grateful for. And as you know, and this is not new news to this group, fear is the enemy, and it's the enemy of just what the opposite of fear is, and that's faith. Faith or fear, which one causes us to function and to operate? And I've heard concerns about fear in our denomination. Fear that we're becoming too focused on societal trends, and that J. Herbert Nelson is doing nothing but trying to rise a raucous across the denomination, trying to say, we got to do these things, folks, and that he's only doing it because of some societal concerns or because he's a black man. And folks, that's just not the truth. The reality, he is a black man. But the reality is we're in the midst of a time in society where even our presidential campaign has eroded to the fact that whoever can instill the greatest amount of fear thinks they can get the greatest votes. And that's just sad. And what do we as a church do about it? How do we respond to it? Our denomination has often risen above fears to speak out for compassion and for peace and for justice and for grace. And I've been in 16 countries over these past 22 months and have seen our mission co-workers who are showing, they're modeling, not fear, but trust and peace and hope and care. And I wish every one of us could get to know all of these people like I have and to see what they're doing in Lebanon and Iraq, what they're doing in Peru with the water crisis, what they're doing in Mexico, where the women I watched give away their babies because they thought the only hope their baby had for a life was to come to the United States, and so they would smuggle them across the border. Or the women who were young, who were smuggling themselves, trying to come across the border because so many women in their community had been trafficked. And I went to a big monument where hundreds of dead women's names were posted, and also lost women's names were posted. And the grief that you felt in this particular park was extraordinary. But our mission co-workers are there in the midst of it, and they're a part of us. They're a part of our family. They're doing things that really do make a difference and matter. And in Mexico, I saw young boys, 6 of them, who were middle school students, and they were in a Presbyterian community center where they were working on computers, learning some techniques, and also learning how to be electricians. Now, they weren't going to be able to go out and hang their shingles, but they would know how to do some things that they could make a little bit of money. And in talking to an interpreter and with my tad bit of Spanish, I asked them, what are you doing this for? Why are you doing it? And all of them said, well, we've been recruited by the cartels. And we know if we were to go to the cartel that we would be able to protect our moms and our sisters because the cartel wouldn't let anything happen to them. We know that if we did that, we'd have money enough for food. We'd have so many more opportunities. But we also know that the likelihood we'd live more than 2 or 3 years is very unreal. And consequently, it seems to us that being a part of a faith community where we can learn more about our potential, these are my words, but this is what they were expressing. Our potential as human beings is something that we want to be a part of. So they were so grateful to the denomination. On and on, so many stories about that I could talk about, but I don't want to take all the rest of my time because in a minute I want to give you a chance to ask me questions. Many of you know I've been holding conversation across our country with various bodies of our denomination. And the questions I've asked have focused on who and what we're called to be as Christ's church. Concurrently, the Office of the General Assembly and some other bodies of our denomination, like the Next Church, have engaged our members in conversation through surveys. You'll be hearing results of these in the coming weeks, and they're all being geared in to come to a new committee at this General Assembly called the Way Forward Committee. All of the recommendations, the Moderator's report that I will give on what I've seen and observed, the OGA study on what the church, in the largest response of any church survey of its kind in church history in this country, not Presbyterians, church history. We had more people, percentage-wise, respond, and a broad demographic background, from broad demographic backgrounds, so that we are very confident that the data we have is truly representative of who we are as a body. All of these are going to be fed in, and Presbytery overtures like Foothills Presbytery has come up with suggestions about how things should be restructured. There's so many things about a church that right now is saying the moment is ripe for us to change and cast our nets on the other side of the boat and find out who and what we can be in the ways that we're called to be. But I do want to tell you a couple of the results, even though all of them aren't out yet and I don't have the final data. The first one is we're a church that cares deeply about being reformed and reforming. That came through loudly by the people in our denomination. And that many don't know necessarily what that means specifically. Maybe some of us don't know either, but at any rate, they do know that we are, as a church, must continue to be changing and growing and becoming more than we were yesterday. And that the world we're going to be in tomorrow is going to be different from the world we're in today. So how do we reform in order to do that? A large number of people have responded that that it's a part of our DNA to be changing. That's who we've been since our inception, and that's who we need to continue to be. It doesn't need to be done in order for us to gain large numbers of members. It doesn't need to be done because we're trying to recapture who we once were. But the church is saying we need to define who we are, both to ourselves and the world, and we need to spend our energy and resources on being that church. And related to that is the fact that as Presbyterians we value the wonderful gift of the human mind. We as Presbyterians care about thinking. We care about education. We have modeled that. In fact, we have been the leaders of that in Protestantism in this country particularly. According to Eileen Linder, one of the great minds in our denomination, she says it is in short a hunger to realign educational capacity not only in preserving truths of the past, but as a means to engage the challenges of the future. And I wonder, could this have something to do with our understanding as a denomination that we're called to cast our nets on the other side? Another finding of the study indicates that institutional loyalty to the U.S.A. and to our local congregations is deep and abiding. Presbyterians show evidence of rediscovering and reapplying the cherished traditions of their heritage, education and faith formation among them, as the organizing principles for meeting the multiple changes of a rapidly changing world. And we believe we're called to do more than just learn about and understand God's Word. And that brings me very briefly to what's happening with theological education. Did you know we put more money into theological education, twice as much money as the second largest denomination in this country's resources that go to, let me rephrase that. We put twice as much money And the next denomination, and I'm not positive if it's the Methodists, but the next denomination only has half of what we do, because we have believed so long that education is critical. We're the only church that started out saying that the academic gown was an appropriate thing to wear in the pulpit. We have said over and over again, learned, educated leaders are key. My wife is from Wilson, North Carolina, Peggy, and she had a precious little woman about this tall who was her piano teacher growing up. We all called her Aunt Louise. Even after I married in the family, Aunt Louise would come and have lunch. Aunt Louise was the best Southern Baptist you've ever known. But as she'd sit around the dining table, she'd say, I need to tell you something, Heath. I know you're going to seminary, and I'm so glad, because whenever I want to hear a good sermon, I come over here to the Presbyterian Church. That's the reputation we've had. And that's a reputation we want to continue in so many ways. But we also need to know that as we look at theological education, there's a lot of appropriate questions. And our presidents are asking these in a strategic planning process they're in right now. Where are we going in theological education? Is the model of theological education that we in this room have gone through and have affirmed and value the one that we need for the future? And if it isn't, are we brave enough to make some changes and transitions? And there's a lot about that we could talk about if you want to explore it more fully. And the final insight I want to share from my conversations and from some of the survey findings is that our denomination is realizing that we are more theologically and socially progressive than folks had thought we were. We as a denomination have been told over and over again, well, our leaders are pretty liberal and progressive, but the mainstream of our denomination isn't. Well, folks, we're finding that is absolutely not true. So the challenge is, what do we do with that? It isn't a matter of us saying, aha, those of us who might be progressive or liberal, we see. The goal isn't to rule. The goal is to say, how do we be family when we come from different ideas, thoughts, and value systems? And how do we look at ways that we can work together in order to be stronger and to do the kinds of things that God's calling us to do? Well, there's so much more I want to share with you, but out of respect for time, I want to mention the very last passage that I use and consider it essential in our efforts to the church today. Again, it's familiar, and it's Romans 8. You can quote it by heart, probably, but in the context of this message, think of it with a renewed sense of joy. You know, we are all servants of Jesus Christ our Lord, and whether or not we are the U.S.A. or some other manifestation of our understanding of what it means to be a church, we are not the ones who are going to kill the church, nor are we the ones who are going to assure its survival. Indeed, we are caretakers, but the ultimate and final plan for who will be is not solely on our shoulders, thank God. Indeed, we need to be responsible stewards, but we're not the saviors. And that's the promise. That's the good news. So if you hear nothing else that I say tonight, hear this word from Romans, which has added power during this Easter season. Nothing, absolutely nothing can separate you or me from the love of God. Hallelujah. Amen.